Welcome to the JTB Business Travel Fireside Chat on business travel sustainability for SMEs. At JTB, we're committed to eliminating the global travel carbon footprint and facilitating the change needed to reach our collective goal and reshape travel. The global travel demand is steadily increasing, and along with it, the need for change is increasing. So now more than ever, we need innovative solutions that are accessible, practical, and effective for all. This is why we have asked global travel thought leaders to sit with us and share their insight on sustainable travel, highlight the opportunities, and address the obstacles SMEs face when adjusting their travel program to include sustainability practices while still controlling costs. My name is Kim Lagos, Vice President at JTB Business Travel. We were planning to host this session live in Amsterdam, but unfortunately COVID put a toll on that, and we're doing this online instead. I'm joining you today from Stockholm, Sweden, and I'm very happy, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our two great partners and friends of JTB Business Travel. Ladies first, Ramona van der Zon, Director Sustainable Strategy at KLM, responsible for guiding KLM towards a truly sustainable strategy. And also a big welcome to Christian Moller-Holst, CEO and founder of Goodwings, a B Corporation certified hotel booking platform that makes it easy and affordable for businesses to reduce their travel emissions. Thank you so much, both of you, for being with us today. We have a lot to cover in this session, and today our goal is to provide insight, but also offer up some very practical, effective, and accessible ways for our viewers to use to overcome the obstacles they might be facing when making their travel programs more sustainable. We'll also discuss where to find opportunities to make change happen and how to participate in sustainability within your organization, regardless of your size of the budget. So with that said, let's get started. Ramona, alongside with your strong passion for environment, I know that you have a background as a photographer as well. How did you find your way into the travel industry?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, making photographs is not something that I do for professional purposes anymore, but I do while traveling. So that still is part of my life, I would say. But after my graduation in communications and thereafter also sustainability, I found my way to KLM, the airline, by actually doing my graduation at the company. So I've been looking into the carbon offset project that they had at that time, and defining the social and environmental impact of the project. So that was how to get into the company, especially, but also it was because I had on one hand passion for sustainability and the background because of my studies, and on the other hand also passion for traveling. So where can I do that better than within the airline industry and try to make impact there? So that was how I get there.
Wonderful. So you were actually living your dream, yes?
Yeah, I would say so.
Okay, that's great. And welcome also, Christian. Thank you so much for joining today. I know that you have studied business philosophy at Copenhagen Business School. How did that lead to you becoming a big player within the travel industry?
That's a really good question. It was actually, I was in the Danish Army as an officer for 3 years. And then I knew I wanted to go and study business. And by funny circumstances, I ended up studying philosophy and business, which really had a big impact on my choice of career because, as you know, philosophy is about reflecting and analyzing and understanding, deconstructing businesses. And I think for the topic of today, what's more appropriate than reflecting on what's our responsibility as individuals and businesses in reshaping travel, reshaping the responsibility of travel. So I was looking at an industry that, in my view, didn't really do much in terms of green leadership. Not pointing fingers at anyone, but I'm looking at the entire industry, including online travel platforms, which control more and more, and really thought that hey, we need to rethink the way that online travel platforms work and their role. And yeah, I can dive more into that later on in the discussion. Yeah, so I entered the travel industry 6 years ago, and it's been a fun ride since.
Definitely. Well, that is the travel industry is a lot about rights. We are just coming out of obviously the pandemic. Now we're facing different challenges, but sustainability, as you both have mentioned, is a thing that we should have been acting on for 30 years ago. But at least now everybody is really keen on acting on that. So a little bit talking about the measures that we have aboard. Ramona, I have been looking at the sustainability report of KLM and AirFrance, and you have put up some very high-level goals, or very sort of aggressive goals, ambitious goals. 10% sustainable aviation fuel on board aircraft by 2030. 30% less emissions per passenger kilometer in 2030 compared to 2019. 64% of new generation aircraft in your fleet by 2023. 40% reduction in noise footprint compared to the 2000s. That's very ambitious goals. How did your company decide on these goals, and why?
Yeah, that's a good question. So actually, we see sustainability as something that's not only about the green part of sustainability or the climate part or the eco part. Sustainability we see sustainability as a broad concept. So we've been really looking at the Sustainable Development Goals from set in 2015, looking into all subjects of where we can have an impact on. And of course, we know that when assessing your impact as a business, and especially as an airline, you will find out that CO2 and your climate impact is one of the largest parts of, the largest part of impact where you're heading to. So that's why the focus of our team, but especially our company, is also on reducing this carbon footprint, because what we know is that, of course, this big carbon footprint mainly comes from the fuel, the fossil kerosene that we use as airlines. So knowing that the biggest chunk of work actually is in that part, and where we have the most direct influence on as well, we've set ourselves ambitions. That's not something new. So actually the ambitions that you mentioned are the ones that we have set related to CO2, are the ones that we have set last year, and are we wanted to commit to the Science Based Targets Initiative, so to be really in line with what the boundaries of the planet are, I would say. But actually we already have CO2 goals and ambitions for a longer time than last year. So we had ambitions for 2015, for 2020, and now we are also looking to 2030, and on the longer term to 2050. But I think it's really important to mention that these in-between goals are something where you have to strive to, because it also urges you or gives you the speed to work on it today and tomorrow, and not over in about 10 years from now. So that's why we've set these shorter term goals, intermediate goals for 2030 as well. And just one thing to mention is that we do not only have these goals on the CO2 part, but we also have goals on, for example, waste reduction. So that's where it reflects, like, in a general, broader term, sustainability, what sustainability is for our company.
I understand, and obviously airlines is a very complex operations. I mean, you have a huge operation, so it does make a lot of sense that you are taking sort of the step-by-step approach, and that's also looking on the long-term vision, short-term, long-term as well. So yeah. I'm very happy and to see that the approach that KLM has in that
and
sense.
Maybe in addition to that, why this short and longer term vision is also important is because there is some certain measures that we can take today, as renewing our fleet, for example, which directly influences the efficiency numbers. So that's something we do today, and we did yesterday, and we can do tomorrow. But there's also a part that we don't know yet about. So can we fly on hydrogen, for example, or the amount of sustainable aviation fuel that we are going to use that will speed up until 2030, but we expect the largest ramp up after 2030. So there's also differences in what we can do today and what we can do on the longer term as aviation.
Yeah, and it's also true. I mean, the new aircraft is so much more quieter than the old ones. I just love it when you get to fly a new aircraft in that sense. Christian, Goodwings is a certified B corporation that's primary mission is to help businesses reduce travel emissions. How did you decide which sustainability measures your company would focus on internally? I mean, beyond your mission as such.
I would say the mission we're on is definitely the most interesting part of our story. We do everything we can, though, to improve our environmental performance outside the core product. We cut down on meat consumption at the office in our team. We have a small office in Latin America now as well. We drive only EV if we don't bike. We have an extended bike culture in Denmark, as you know, as in the Netherlands. And we try to address our responsibility in a very holistic approach as a B Corp. For instance, we look at ownership, who owns the company. And something that I take great pride in is that all employees in Goodwings are granted warrants in the company because they contribute to the success. They create success. So we look very holistically in the way that we run the business, the different stakeholders that we impact or impact us, and how we can benefit as many as possible. But just coming back to the mission we're on, which is what really gets me up in the morning. You asked me earlier why I entered travel, and I just touched briefly upon it. At that time, the real story is this. I found an annual report by Expedia. It could have been any other online platform, but it was Expedia's. And I was amazed that they had $100 billion turnover, or GMV, like $100 billion of flights and hotels and rental cars every year. And out of that, they had roughly $10 billion in revenue, so 10%. And out of the $10 billion, they spent almost 8 billion, 80% on advertising. And that drove me to start Goodwings, because at the same time they were saying, hey, we can't do anything. The airlines must do all the responsibility, the hotel chains or the consumers must have to buy greener, better solutions, which nobody does. So it was like pushing the responsibility to other groups and stakeholders. And here I was looking at an industry which spends $45 billion on Facebook and TV commercials and Google advertising every year. So that's the mission we're on. That's the money that we take to make biofuel much more affordable for businesses, because many more businesses now want to reduce emissions, are setting reduction targets, but don't know much about biofuel. So we have an educational issue as well. Second, when they start to know about it, they also learn that it comes with a relatively high cost. And that's really the mission we're on. We have set a goal of turning 1 billion trips net zero by 2030. So reducing as much as we can and removing any remaining emissions. And that's like 100,000 times larger than the impact that we can have at the office by biking or eating veggies and so on.
I really love your approach to make it visible for everyone. What can be done? And that I think you're doing a great job in that sense, making it really visible, actionable, like we were saying, for everyone to do their part, because it, like we've been talking about, and we will talk more about this, we're in this together. So each one of us has a responsibility individually, but also we as a society, as a group, and an industry, we have a responsibility. So talking about that, and both of you, do you see moving towards a global landscape where people are and organizations are willing and actually making more green travel choices? What do you see in your daily operations today?
Yeah, so I think what we see is that there is more and more demand also from the customer to find more sustainable travel options, I would say. And I think it's also important to have it indeed both ways. So it should be a mission or ambition from a company intrinsically, but external pressure helps, of course, speeding it up. So either if it's policymakers or governments or customers or NGOs, for example. I think what we now see in the travel industry, at least in the Dutch context, but I think broader in Europe, there's a lot of people talking about the impact of flying and why sustainability is important. And I think that starts all with this awareness before people are making an another choice, or a choice to compensate for CO2 emissions, or a choice to opt in for sustainable aviation fuel, for example, or a choice to maybe take a train instead of a plane for one of their travel or one of their trips. So yeah, I think it's moving. I think we feel and we see a lot more customers are interested in joining as a more sustainable option. But I also have to be honest, there is still one big component where people are making their base their choices off, and that's price of a ticket as well. So yeah, there is still also at KLM a really small percentage of individual customers that are choosing the voluntary option to opt in for CO2 compensation or SAF. It's around 2%. It's really small, so that can be bigger. But on the other hand, we see bigger corporates that are changing their travel policies, and they are making the bigger steps. So that's also what we see.
That's a very good. Sorry, Christian. That's a very. I would like to move to our first poll because again, like Ramona was saying, travel policies is something that will affect the way companies book travel. So let's move to our first poll of the day. Does your company have sustainable goal? Large enterprises have increasingly set net zero goals for travel, but where are SMEs today? They're not having the same resources available as larger companies, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they cannot be a force of change. Small and attainable goals can go a long way. So let's see what the poll suggests about our audience, what our audience is saying, and here we go. 43% has sustainable goals, 29 do not, 29 I do not know. That's actually a very interesting result. Christian, what are your thoughts seeing the results?
I think it's going to change quite significantly in the recent years. And just to follow up on what Ramona said earlier, which I 100% agree with, that we see the traction, the demand as well from businesses, not to the extent that we would like, but definitely a much stronger demand than with consumers. And I think there are really three reasons for this, and those three reasons will also change that poll if you do that in 12 months' time. One is the newly approved EU legislation on greenhouse gas emission disclosure. So companies of more than 250 employees as of 24, but really 23, will have to measure their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, including that of business travel. So, and it's not just about measuring how much you emit in your production, in your business travel, etc. It's also setting reduction targets. And that, I think, is a key element in the legislation, because it drives business leaders and professionals to start looking at, oh, we're emitting 700 tons a year with our business. What should we aim for next year? The reduction targets. And then when you start to look at reduction targets and setting those, you start to investigate solutions. And there are solutions in the travel space, as opposed to other industries which are even harder to abate. So I think definitely we're going to see more and more companies having goals on sustainability, and specifically on climate, and also reduction targets. Also because business leaders are also human beings. They also want to take action. They also want to attract and retain talent. And who wants to work in a company which does not in some way contribute to solving the climate issue? So for many reasons, it's a good business decision. For companies, now legislation is also pushing things forward, which is great.
And again, a little bit going further into what you were just saying, Ramona, who do you think will drive the real change towards truly sustainable travels? Is it Christian was talking about the new EU directive coming out, or is it the travelers? Is it the governments? How does KLM see your role in driving change?
So ideally, I would say, well, it's coming from the businesses themselves, but I would not I don't think that all businesses are at that stage that they are intrinsically motivated to reduce their footprint as much as possible. So I think maybe a bit of repeating what I just said, it's a combination of of all of them. So it's indeed your own motivations, your own policies, the customer demands, and regulation, policymakers, etc. But I think that it's underestimated how big the voice of the customer could be, because if customers are massively like asking for a different travel opportunity, for example, this could speed things up. So it will definitely help, I would say. And actually supported by the right regulation, supportive regulation, this could accelerate. So I would say it's a combination, but don't underestimate like the customer voice, I would say, in this.
Yeah. So what we're seeing here is that, first of all, there is a will of the travelers, like both of you are saying, to really do something, to make sustainable choices. There is also the governments putting and organizations putting directives into place. And larger companies might already, like we said before, larger companies might already have a lot of resources and to put things in place. But also looking on the recovery that is happening now after the pandemic, SMEs has actually been the part of the industry that has been driving the movement towards recovery. While they might not have the same means and resources as the larger enterprises to tackle the issue of sustainable travel, to making their program more sustainable, they know they want to set a target. The travelers want to do it, but how can they do this? What opportunities do you see, Christian, for SMEs to continue on this path, and what should they think of as a first step?
As a first step, they should definitely go to goodwings.com. Well, I had to say that. No, really, I think
of course
today, just as opposed to just 2 or 3 years ago, there is a wide array of great online tools. Look at SME Climate Hub or many other collective and collaborative platforms where you can find great online tools that can help you set a direction of your company across industries. There are tools available today that helps you calculate your emissions, set reduction targets, and also provide you with solution providers that can help you improve your footprint. But really, many of the companies that come to us, architects, designers, fashion, business travel is a big part of their footprint. And in some cases, it's 75% of the total footprint. And it is somewhat a blind spot. I think definitely coming back to Ramona's point, the relatively high cost of both offsetting, but in particular biofuels, is definitely a reason for many companies not even considering it. So I mean that's really why we exist, because we want to make it accessible for more SMEs, because SMEs are going to face they're also going to change their operations and improve their footprint, not just because of legislation, but also because of the supply chain demands, the trickle down effect from the large companies who are now requiring their suppliers and sub-suppliers to improve their environmental performance. So we need to help the SMEs, and that is why Goodwings exists. We want to help the SMEs get easy and accurate data for their travel emissions, and alongside with that, the opportunity of reducing with biofuel at a much lower cost than if they purchased it directly from the airline. Because what we do in effect is we take our commission and we purchase it for them. That's the philosophy of Goodwings, really, is to put a product on the market which is more or less the same as hotels.com or booking.com, but every time you book with us, we don't use the commission on advertising, the $45 billion spend. We use that money on biofuel and reforestation, so we could do something about the emissions that unfortunately cannot be avoided.
So this is a good timing now for our second poll, where I would like to ask our viewers do you think there are enough sustainable travel options when it comes to flights, hotel, and car rental? Again, a company can have lofty goals, but if there are not enough opportunity to really choose more sustainable travel options, change might take too long. Currently, travel options focus a lot on time, schedule, price, or amenities, but sustainability is not often a selling point to the traveler. So let's hear what our viewers are feeling here. Here we go. Well, here we clearly see a challenge for the industry, I believe. There are no sustainable travel options when it comes to making travel planning and booking your travel. Ramona, what are your thoughts on this result?
Yeah, I think it's understandable. I think first, it all starts with indeed assessing your impact. So looking at what is your carbon footprint from traveling, and I will echo what Christian said. Like for aviation, our scope 1 emission is biggest, and it's fuel use, fossil kerosene. But for a company that does not produce things, but more, for example, a consultant will have a really big part of their emissions would be business travel, for example. So what can you do then to reduce this impact? And it first, of course, it starts with the question if you have to make the trip. And we're now also used to, well, I'm happy that we can do this fireside chat actually online, but it's a solution. Now you can use it. But there's, of course, always circumstances or events where you want to be in person, and that's also very valuable. So looking into your travel options, if it's the plane or a train, for example, which is more accessible in Europe probably than in other parts of the world. But then also looking into an addition to sustainable aviation fuel. So what we did as KLM in 2012 is starting this corporate biofuel program, and now it's called corporate SAF program, which gives the opportunity to corporate customers to pay the price difference actually between fossil kerosene and sustainable aviation fuel, and thereby also reducing part of their carbon footprint. And this is a solution we now also offer to individual customers. So if people book a flight on our website, they can also opt in for sustainable aviation fuel, and up to a certain percentage that they can afford. Because indeed, what also Christian said, sustainable aviation fuel is a very expensive option. So it should also be an affordable option, and therefore it's important to also keep it also having a low price and make it affordable for everyone to choose. But there's also other things. So you may also think of weight reduction. So what do you take on board? Every gram that you prevent taking on board saves fuel use and CO2 emissions. So there's also little things that you can think of there. Same for choosing your hotels and accommodations. Do these hotels have an environmental label, for example? Do they look into their carbon footprint? It's all things where you can look into defining a more sustainable trip. But also maybe Christian, you have additions to that.
Yeah, so and exactly, I was just about to ask Christian about that. Normally when you book accommodation, it's all about the location, and that's at least for me when I do business travel. I where I'm going, the hotel closest to that has a decent standard and meets my needs. That would be how I would make my choice. How can I be more sustainable when I select hotels?
That's a really good question. There are two reasons that we focus on the CO2 emissions of your travel. Because when you book your hotel with us, we don't sell you the flight ticket or the train. We just sell you the hotel, and we use the hotel commission to reduce your emissions, including those of your flight. So we take a responsibility which is a bit further than what we probably should, because we're not even supplying the flight ticket directly with you. But the reason we do that is because obviously, if you look at your total travel footprint, the emissions from your flights, from aviation, is the biggest part. You emit around 25 to 30 kilos of CO2 per night in a hotel, depending on which country, because countries have different levels of CO2 emissions in their electricity supply and so on, obviously. But one of the things that have astonished us, and we're still working on that, is that the industry is very little focused on sustainability historically and still today. So the big databases that we get the hotels from, we have 1.5 million hotels on the platform. So obviously we don't do contracts with each and every hotel. So we are dependent on databases or data providers. I have asked them like consistently for 6 years, can you please tell me which hotels have solar panels, which hotels have implemented waste management or water management systems, or LGBT rights, etc., etc. Those dimensions simply do not exist in the industry. And then when you dive into the so-called hotel certifications, I found that there are more than 850. Most of them developed by the hotels themselves, which is completely unreliable. So there is an intrinsic, very little focus on responsibility in a broader context, and especially on sustainability in the industry. That at least is my experience, and therefore the key focus has been on price, like Ramona said earlier. And I think the OTAs, which is the space that we represent in this fireside chat, the OTAs have done a horrible job the last 20 years. Obviously, they democratized the access to data, and you could compare flight tickets and hotel rates, etc. And there is a consumer advantage in that. But the dark side of it has been a 100% focus on price. So how can you expect, after you spend 2 hours finding that plane ticket as cheap as possible, finding the best deal at a hotel in New York, how do you expect people to pay 175 euros to mitigate their emissions? It's counterintuitive. So that's why we need to completely rethink the way the value chain works. And that's why we're tapping into these $45 billion that our competitors, Booking.com, Expedia, all these guys, are spending every year in advertising, which creates zero value to people and planet. I would much rather steal those $45 billion and, together with KLM, use that money for increasing production volumes of SAF so we can reduce the cost and we can make it mainstream.
I think you're coming into something very, very interesting, and I'm personally, I always have had that thought about how the price, again, the price versus sustainability, is it a contradiction, or how is that? How does that work? That's always puzzled me in that sense. And I also believe that again today, it is critical for the industry to really provide a solution where customers, you were talking about data, and it's about the visibility of the impact, and that needs to come from the beginning. When you're planning your travel, you need to be aware of the impacts of the choices that you're about to make, and that the only way to do that is to provide the data. So we as an industry, we really need to focus on providing that data, tapping into tools that can allow us show the expected climate impact. And again, like you were saying, does the hotel have solar panels? How's the waste management? KLM also has been talking about that. Bring less luggage on you. You don't have to carry everything with you. Think twice about when you're packing. I mean, those things will help us make a better choice. And I would love to see, personally, I would love to see a place where we start talking about that the priorities is the sustainability before the price, or at least that it comes to a closer level as such. So again, talking about price versus sustainability, Ramona, what do you consider being the top 3 challenges regarding travel sustainability, and specifically for SMEs? What do you think are the most challenging parts, and any thoughts on how to solve these challenges moving ahead?
Yeah, so I think price is, of course, a very big component of where you base, also as an SME, of course, your tickets or your flights that you choose out of. And I think what we at least tried since the start of this year is to include a certain amount of SAF in each ticket sold from departure level Amsterdam. It's only about a few euros, so it depends on the flight distance, €1 to 12 euros, and about the cabin class that you fly with, because an economy class has less CO2 footprint than a business class ticket, for example. We are showing that to the customer as well to make them aware of it. But that's at least a start, because in the end, we don't want sustainability or sustainable aviation fuel as an opt-in option. It should be part of your normal ticket. It should be like the way it is in the future. So that's why we started with this 0.5%. So it's only 0.5% of SAF that customer is paying now with buying a ticket from Amsterdam. But it's something, and it's a start, and we are going to double these amounts, and have it in increasing amounts until 2030, and probably also beyond, to make it a standard. But then it's also, I hope it can be an example also for the industry to include this in their tickets, because if not only KLM is going to include it in the price, but also the other airlines are going to do that, then it's just the way it is, right? Then it's not a race to the bottom in terms of price, because if it's still the race to the bottom, then someone will not choose for KLM maybe in the future, but for another airline that has the lowest fare, and that would be a pity, because you want to have more customers choose for this more sustainable option. And I would say this 0.5%, it doesn't make you sustainable. So I wouldn't say 0.5% or 1% or 5% SAF. It's not. It can be marked as a sustainable ticket, but it's at least a step in the right direction, and that's where we have to go to. But I can imagine that for an SME, it's really a difficult choice if you are purchasing a ticket that's more like 100 euros more expensive than another ticket. It's quite big amount, so that's quite a challenge.
But obviously that's also, it could be also part of the return on investment seen on the trip. Like you were saying, 100 euro could be seen as a cost, but it also it's an investment as such, and something that we all should consider while making the choices of traveling. And I think that listening to you and also listening to Christian, one of the things again is really looking on, why am I doing this trip? What's the purpose? What's the return on investments? There are many other elements that needs to be brought into that decision process, and that really is where we as an industry have a task to deliver a to Z solution, where from the planning part and also making it visible for everyone, educating people and making the right choices. And talking about that, Ramona, coming back to you again, what do you think is the most important metric that can be used to consider for how to make sustainability to succeed?
Yeah, so I think CO2 makes sense to start with your CO2 emissions as an SME. So really define your carbon footprint in this, and look into, well, our travel modalities that you take, but also the different airlines that you fly with, because indeed Christian also mentioned it earlier on. There's like dozens of tools online to define your carbon footprint, and I think that's where you have to start with. So I would start with CO2 because it's, for example, really difficult to define waste, for example, your waste footprint over your whole travel journey. I think it's the future, because sustainability is not only about CO2 and the climate impact. So we'll see that it's going to be broader than CO2, but I think starting with that makes sense.
Great. So let's move to our last poll, poll number 3. And again, a little bit listening to the thoughts of our viewers. What is more important when booking travel? And again, like we were saying, at some point, being serious about more sustainable travel means choosing lower carbon impact over lowest price. As long as more sustainable travel options may come at a higher cost, that requires change management. Most of us are so focused on, price. So let's see what our audience thinks about this. So still, cost is most important. Time and convenience. Unfortunately, sustainability and carbon footprint is at the bottom. Christian, how do we make sustainability and carbon footprint being the most important factor when people are making their choices?
We don't. I think we really have to acknowledge that companies have to balance many things. They need to be profitable. At the same time, they need to be and want to be more sustainable and responsible companies. So we need to find ways of addressing the cost. I think that's really the key here. If we ask companies to spend longer time getting from A to B, or choosing more expensive alternatives, we're only going to move the needle slightly. If we want to make this mainstream, if we really want to get the SMEs on board, which is the mission we're on, because the enterprise companies are already moving and have been moving for several years. Now it's time to get the 80% of the global workforce who works for an SME to start moving as well. So we need to make it easy and affordable. That's the only way forward. If we can do that and we can tackle costs, then you will see in your next poll in 12 months, you'll see sustainability as high as everything.
That's really true, and thank you for those comments, Christian. Talking about SMEs and talking about also the new generations coming into the industry. Christian, are we seeing certain generations embracing sustainable travel over others? Will millennials, Gen Z, need to be the one to solve the challenges to make the real change happen? Or what do you think?
I have a funny anecdote. I was a panelist at a climate event, which was in London a couple of years back, prior to COVID, and it was hosted in a very nice BMW showroom in a very warm summer evening in London. And it was 18 to 22-year-old London guys and girls, and we were talking climate, and they were very enthusiastic. And they were all wearing designer clothes and $2,000 iPhones. And then I started to talk about the individual responsibility. And then the conversation was not so much anymore. I think I really, first of all, we focus mostly on B2B. So businesses is my domain. We do have some leisure clients who hear about Goodwings and use our service. But what we see is it's not specifically young people. It's actually all generations, because I think, and I can see that in my own company today. My coworkers that I employ who are above 50 are just as climate concerned as my 3 sons. So I think it's all generations who we need to get on board. And I don't think the younger generations are more inclined to spend more of their hard-earned money on greener solutions unless there is some sort of identity marker to it. That's the honest truth.
Yeah, and again, I think like we're saying, the more we talk about this and the more people are educated and trained about the facts going on right now, the impact that the global carbon footprint has and the climate changes around the world, it impacts everyone, regardless of generation. And again, like both of you have been saying, we're really in this together. So any action that all of us can take will continue to drive the changes. Talking a little bit about carbon offsetting, Christian, many companies are incorporating carbon offsetting to achieve net zero. Ideally, carbon offsetting is a temporary addition while companies craft their carbon reduction plan to reach a net zero goal. Because again, offsetting is not really the solution. Reduction is what's going to help us to reach the net zero goal. Do you think we should, by now, rather focus on removal of carbon emissions over carbon offsetting?
I have a very long answer, but I'll try to make it very briefly. If you look at what came out of the Paris Agreement, if you look at COP27, we need to do 2 things. We need to ensure that we have a transition to a fossil-free future in all industries, including aviation. But we also need to protect existing forest areas. We've cut down 12 or 13% of the global tree coverage in the last 20 years. That's not a very wise thing to do, because nature is Earth's ability to cope with the emissions that we continue to pump out. So we need to protect existing forest, especially native forest, and then we need to increase forest areas. So offsetting in the sense of tree planting is definitely a viable and very important solution, and should not be underestimated. I have to stress that. But we need to only invest in projects that live up to certain principles of integrity, such as additionality. So when I see companies, including travel companies who are buying carbon credits relatively cheap from solar plants or windmill projects, where you can, like renewable energy credits, RECs, and you can really start to question the additionality of those types of projects, because they don't need the carbon credits. The problem is they started 8 years ago, so they can continue to sell credits without any problem. But what we need to do is we need to move away from carbon credit or offsetting schemes where additionality is somewhat questioned, and move into what is needed, which is protecting and restoring forest areas, all while investing in and scaling up the use of biofuel, because that is, of course, the end solution. I don't think hydrogen, or for that matter, electric airplanes, and Ramona probably knows a hell of a lot more than me about this, but out of those three solutions, electricity or hydrogen or hybrid maybe, and SAF biofuel is definitely the most realistic and scalable solution that we have, because you can use it in existing infrastructure and engines. So we need to really start using biofuel, because the more we use it, the more the price will go down, and then it becomes mainstream. But while we do that, we have to mitigate the emissions that we cannot avoid, because we can't afford to do so. And that requires investing in verified nature projects.
Talking about, Christian, thank you very much for that input. And you did mention sustainable aviation fuel. There is a misconception that the primary benefit of sustainable aviation fuel is lower emissions, when it's actually all about the production methods. Am I right saying so, Ramona? Can you tell us more about sustainable aviation fuel and how that will help us achieve our goals?
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. So first of all, I would like to echo what Christian said about carbon offsets, because it's indeed, companies should focus first on reducing their own environmental footprint, their own carbon emissions. But then second, it's really valuable to keep investing in these carbon offset projects, because they capture CO2 now, so to say. And you can also do investments in the future, but that will not reduce CO2 now. And we also need reductions and capture now, today. So that's why it's also the same approach for KLM. Focus on reduction first, but carbon offsetting is part of this strategy. Then if you look into what can be done, like in between, reduction can be realized by new aircraft, making use of more efficient engines, for example, so that requires less energy use for the same distance. But then there's still energy needed to fly your aircraft. So a liquid kerosene for the current aircraft, or a liquid fuel, sorry, is still something that's needed. You can replace that by a sustainable alternative, a more sustainable alternative. Sustainable aviation fuel is like a terminology for a lot of different types of alternative fuel. So you can make sustainable aviation fuel from waste materials, such as used cooking oil, but you can also make sustainable aviation fuel from agriculture or forestry residues from these sectors. And you can make sustainable aviation fuel from CO2 and water and energy. So that's a synthetic kerosene. I think the first two are closer to now. So used cooking oil we already use in our aircraft as a basis for sustainable aviation fuel. Synthetic kerosene is something that has the most potential, I would say, because you don't need used cooking oil is there only in a certain amount. So we don't have enough used cooking oil in the world to fly all our aircraft on. So we need a type of fuel that has limited boundaries, in that case, for the feedstock amount. So synthetic kerosene, if you can make it only from energy, water, and CO2, there is an abundance of CO2, of course, if you can capture it from the air, for example. The only thing is that electricity should be a renewable one, so it should be green energy. That is a challenge, because not only aviation needs green energy, but all sectors in the world needs to decarbonize and use renewable energy. So there is a challenge there, but in theory, but also in practice, this can have a really big CO2 reduction effect. And fuels that we now use, alternative fuels, have a reduction amount of around 75 to 80% CO2 reduction compared to the use of fossil kerosene. That's realized in the life cycle of the process of this whole sustainable aviation fuel. how it's being made. Synthetic kerosene even has the potential to have a higher reduction amount if it's made with the right energy usage, so the renewable energy. So there is different types of sustainable aviation fuel that can be used, but the one thing is the same: it's safe and it can be used in all our current aircraft that we fly on. And that's a really important aspect, of course, because aircraft that we purchase today or tomorrow are flying for the next 25 years. So well, and then we're almost approaching 2050, of course. So it's really necessary to find a solution for the current type of aircraft, and SAF accommodates to that.
Yeah, and I really, you said something really interesting there, Ramona. The new aircrafts coming today are going to be with us for 20-25 years. So it's critical that we make the right choices today, not to sort of make the mistakes that we just start talking about in the beginning of this session, that we didn't do anything 30 years ago. Because then again, what we do today is really what's going to impact us tomorrow.
Yes, exactly. And maybe in relation to that, what's important to mention is that if you use an alternative fuel, or if you invest in a carbon offset project, it should have a sustainable certification. So you can fly, for example, as an alternative fuel on raw palm oil. We can produce fuel from raw palm oil, but we don't want to, because we have sustainability challenges somewhere else, right? So we don't want to use these raw materials. We only want to use truly sustainable alternatives. And that's why we work, for example, with the RSB, Roundtable Sustainable Biomaterials. They certify the type of fuel as it is a more sustainable alternative to fossil kerosene. And same counts for carbon offsets. You can choose for certifications such as Gold Standard, which is a certification that guarantees not only CO2 emission reduction or CO2 capture, but also the human rights part of it and the ecosystem restoration part of it. And that's important, or maybe as advice also to the SMEs, to look into these certifications and choose the most sustainable out there.
Yeah, again, looking on the entire picture, A to Z, not only what you see the face value, but what's behind it as well. Talking about, we've been talking quite a lot about the existing solutions that are in place now, but obviously there is a great deal of innovation that has sprung out of the need to solve our global climate challenges and the changes that we've been facing, or that has been in place, as well as also COVID as such. Both of you, do you see any new alternative innovations in the horizon that you are feeling currently very optimistic about? What about you, Christian? What do you see around?
I see a trend which I find very comforting, and I think it has to do with COVID. I think a lot of the businesses who use our service, they tell us that they're now back they're back to normal. So travel has returned, but they're still at 75 or 80%. So they have been able successfully to cut out the travel, including the flights, that they could avoid. And that, I think, is a really, really good thing. Secondly, we can see in our data that they travel less but longer. So if you're going across the sea from Europe to the US, instead of going twice a year or twice a quarter, you go once a year or once a quarter, and then you get more out of your trip. And I think that's a really positive thing, because the whole circumstance around traveling during and after COVID was quite difficult, right? With all the passports and certifications and mouthpieces and so on. So we all realized that if we could avoid another trip, let's do it. But now there is also a climate concern. So if we can align these interests and get people back to traveling in a more responsible way, and that includes maybe cutting slightly down but traveling longer, I think that's a really positive thing in terms of travel behavior.
The return of investment, right? Considering, looking at each trip, is it necessary? How do I make it, and such? So
yeah, and maybe exactly, and I think and it might have to do with our clients. I'm not sure if it goes for all other travel platforms or hotel platforms, because I mean, our clients have an incentive of traveling less and longer, because if you only have one trip from Copenhagen to the Netherlands, we know that you'll be emitting 200 kilos. But if you then stay 4 nights in a hotel instead of 2, we have more hotel commission that we can then use to reduce your emissions. So in those cases, we can actually reduce your emissions by 50 or 75% with biofuel. We can cover that high cost. So I don't know.
Ramona, what do you see on your horizon from the airline industry?
Yeah, so I think what we see is that in the broader spectrum of the industry, I think what's really good to see is that more airlines are setting climate targets, for example, but also waste targets, looking at their catering supplies. I think it's really necessary that it's not something from only a few companies in the industry, but it should be a movement. So that's a trend. I think that's going on for the last 3 years, maybe 2 years. Actually, in COVID, we really saw an acceleration in that, and that's really good. Challenging ourselves on if the things that we do are the right things is still very necessary, of course, because we should set climate ambitions that are within the boundaries of what the planet can hold. We should look into the most sustainable alternative fuels, for example. So I think it's really good to keep sharp on that and challenge ourselves, but also learn from other industries, because what we know is that aviation, it's not the travel industry is not an industry that can solve it alone. So there's also, for example, the whole energy industry, of course, but also if you look into shipping is also requesting alternative fuels. So we should look into the collaborations within these industries to find the end solution. I think a trend definitely is that more customers are putting up their demand on more sustainable travel options, but also law and regulation on this. So indeed, EU regulation is coming up, but it will only be more strengthened in the coming years. So it's definitely going to happen, not only in Europe, but I also expect outside of Europe. You also see it in the USA, of course, happening, and that's a good thing, I would say.
Great. Time flies by when you have fun. It's been fantastic to talk to both of you and listening to your thoughts, your insights. I for sure feel that I have learned a lot. Thank you so much, Ramona and Christian, for your time today and for sharing your insights and thoughts. We've learned a lot, and one thing for sure is that there might be challenges ahead of us, but I believe that we have established that there is a will, there are methods, there are tools to make this the change happen and to make travel more sustainable. So I'm super excited about that. It's been awesome to talk to both of you. Thank you to all our viewers today. We look forward to talk to all of you more about sustainable travel programs. Please make sure to visit goodwings.com, KLM.com, and jtbbusinesstravel.com to read more about how we together can make business travel more sustainable. With that, I wish you all a great rest of the day, and thank you very much for joining us today. Have a nice day. Thank you, and goodbye.